everyone, and thank you for tuning into our event today. I'm Callista Chong, the chairperson of the Broad Street Humanities Review, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by three esteemed guests. Founded in 2019, the Broad Street Humanities Review is the University of Oxford's very first student-run undergraduate humanities journal, which aims to invigorate interdisciplinary academic writing in our student community and beyond. This term, we are thrilled to introduce a variety of panels that center on the theme time through different disciplinary lenses. In addition to hosting interesting discussions, we produce timely journal issues with the support of a talented team of writers and editors. We're now calling for pitches and editor applications for our winter issue on the theme time, and more details can be found on our website or social media platforms. We are active on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Now, please allow me to introduce our guests for today. Professor Kwee Kian is currently the Associate Professor of the Department of Chinese Studies at the National University of Singapore. Her current research examines life in post-Suharto West Kalimantan, and her research interests include Southeast Asian history, especially with a focus on Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, Monsoon-Asia, Dutch and British colonialism and imperialism, capitalism, Chinese ethnicity, migration, religion, transnationalism, and entrepreneurial networks. Her publications include The Political Economy of Java's Northeast Coast, and she has contributed book chapters and journal articles including Chinese Economic Dominance in Southeast Asia, a longue durée perspective, and a forthcoming article entitled Of Married Daughters and Caged Chickens, History and Significations of Being Chinese in Southeast Asia. We're very glad to have you here with us today, Hui Kian. Dr. Gelman Taylor taught Indonesian history at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, between 1992 and 2011. Her research focuses on the engagement of the Dutch East Indies Company in Indonesia and South Africa, and on the social history of colonialism. Her books include Indonesia, Peoples and Histories, The Social World of Batavia, European and Eurasian in Colonial Indonesia, Culture and Cleanliness, Indonesian Histories and Global Indonesia. Recent book chapters include Belongings and Belonging, Indonesian Histories and Inventories from the Cape of Good Hope in Exile in Colonial Asia, and Gender in Batavia, Asian History, European Company Town, and the Routledge Handbook of Gender and the Urban Experience, and last but not least, Indonesia, Sultans and the State in Monarchies and Decolonization in Asia in 2020. We're glad to have you here today with us as well, Jean. Last but not least, we have Dr. Jo Guldi, and she's the Associate Professor of History and of Data Science at Southern Methodist University. She's also external faculty of the Stepanovic Institute of the University of Chicago, a fellow of the Radical Exchange Foundation, a fellow of Knowledge Lab at the Center, the Institute, and an affiliate of the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis at Stanford University. She's a former junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and a founding member of SMU's Artificial Intelligence Lab. She's author of Roads to Power, Britain Advanced Infrastructure State in 2010, with David Armitage of the History Manifesto in 2014, and of many articles about the techniques of text mining applied to history, including Critical Search, Journal of Culture and Analytics in 2018. Her second monograph, The Long Land War, The Global Struggle for Occupancy Rights, will be published by Yale in 2020. With several European historians, she's currently leading a regular Zoom seminar to investigate the state of the art in text mining, how it applies to historians' concerns with congressional and parliamentary debates, and how public infrastructure for text mining, the annals of democracy, can support critical, fact-based participation in democratic societies. We're very glad to have you here today with us as well, Jo. Now that we've introduced our panelists, I'll now talk a bit about the format of today's roundtable discussion. Each historian will be presenting her insights on today's theme, Can the Past Present the Future? Following which, we'll move into a free-flowing discussion with me as moderator. Now that all the logistical details have been accounted for, I'd like to invite Professor Hui Kian to begin the session.
Let me just begin. So the title of my talk today is The Chinese in Southeast Asia, Imperialist Desires and Imaginings in the Longue Durée. So the Chinese overseas, especially the Chinese in Southeast Asia, were well known to be the largest of the Chinese overseas. It's said to be more than 90% before 1950s. And apparently even until today, with mass migration from China, it is still more than 65%, according to some experts. Of course, the rise of China, especially in the recent decades, has incurred a lot of suspicions about the diaspora. We have, maybe the next slide, Calista. We have books like Bamboo Network by, and of course, Lords of the Rim. So these types of books fan the scare of the Chinese overseas acting on behalf of rising PRC, People's Republic of China, and that it could be, the diaspora could be its political economic wing. These types of books might be what David Armitage and Joe Guldi calls the dirty longue durée. But this long-term historical approach as towards the Chinese in Southeast Asia, as well as the Chinese overseas, has no lack of attention from professional historians as well. The next slide, please. So history of the Chinese in Southeast Asia has often attracted a lot of historians' attention. And as noted by Armitage and Guldi, there is also a similar tendency to for historians to break into distinctive periods of study because of the source materials, the languages required, as well as the expertise. So the tendency is to break the study into, especially on the history of Chinese in Southeast Asia, into early modern period around 1500 to 1800, the age of migration, that is according to McCune, 1840 to 1940, as well as the post-colonial period. And there are various very dominant images about the Chinese in Southeast Asia that emerge from these historical studies. Firstly, there is, especially with regards to from 1500 to up to mid-20th century, the sense that they were acting as colonial intermediaries, sometimes also said to be coadjutors, as well as a newer image of them as co-colonizers. The second image is that Chinese sojourners and how they are turned patriotic Chinese, or what we say in Chinese, 爱国华侨, especially during the late 19th, early 20th century, when China was banning overseas Chinese nationalism types of propaganda. The third image, very dominant image, is that of the Chinese in Southeast Asia is of them as economic animals, and sometimes termed also on the negative side as economic predators. So besides this breakup in the periods of study, we do have very major scholars who do synthesis work, and they have written longue durée histories. Very prominent examples, maybe the next slide, is Professor Wang Gangwu's. He has written a lot about the Chinese in Southeast Asia, and his 2000 book on the Chinese overseas from earthbound China to the quest for autonomy. And the other very important book, which was published in 2008 by Philip Kuhn, is on Chinese among others. These two books explore, in the first one by Wang, 2 millennium of the history of the Chinese overseas. Philip Kuhn's book is much more dealing with the period from around mid-16th century until the present. So we have seen that whether it is in terms of longue durée or short durée historical analysis, however, there is a sustained treatment of Chinese as a positivist identity category. And that this is, of course, quite problematic, especially in spite of the fact that both major scholars, Wang and Kuhn, has asserted the transformation, especially in terms of the shift in political loyalty, which is really a concern to fend off fears of the Chinese overseas as fifth column of communist China during the height of the Cold War. But it turns the way that it has been treated, especially in terms of a positivist identity category, tends to endorse a sense of forever Chinese and persisting links with China, albeit perhaps not political, but certainly a kind of continual cultural links with China that will not be broken with this sense of Chinese forever. And hence, we can see that there is an ambivalent position taken by Wang at the end of his book, when he says that he's not sure what this Chinese overseas will do when China becomes a global economic power, and how they in any case, they will be keeping their cultural autonomy. So the next slide, please. To complicate the issue, the PRC state in recent years has been endorsing the longue durée. That is, we see this south of the ocean, or Xiananyang in Chinese, CCTV, Chinese Central Television Network documentary, which was released in 2013, endorsing these historical arguments, whether it's in terms of fostering the dominant historical images of the Chinese in Southeast Asia to become a sense of forever Chinese. And there, besides this 2013 documentary, there's also, especially in the recent 2 to 3 years, the series of Huaqiao Huaren Shihua, which is about the overseas Chinese and their historical and their histories. And this series is also endorsing a longue durée history, talking about different countries in Southeast Asia and how again propagating a kind of longue durée history. And in these productions by the sponsored by the PRC state, these are recruiting historical experts, professional historical experts in the making of the historical documentary as well as the historical publication series. And of course, in the big picture, it is really to get these ethnic Chinese overseas to service its needs, whether it is in terms of whether they were in terms of the business investments and contributions, or whether it's in terms of supporting China's agenda while they were overseas. And this, of course, has real political implications when we are already seeing in this global pandemic situation, the attacks on Asian-looking people because of COVID-19, because of this sense of alleged links between China and the Chinese overseas, as well as suspicions on local Chinese citizens as spies, some of which are real, and hence even more suspicions. In other words, longue durée can be a problematic tool, whether or not it's done by professional historians, and especially if it's using uncritical analytical methods, and even it could service the needs of the new economic superpower, uprising superpower, the PRC. And it signals a real need that we not only need, there's not only a need for longue durée history, but one that provides a radically new reading. So instead of treatment as a positivist identity category, maybe the next slide, I would argue for linking capitalism, imperialism, and racial construction to understand the history of Chinese in Southeast Asia. And I'm drawing really from critical scholarship from the transatlantic Black studies, as well as the Native and Asian American studies, as well as to explore the relationship between racialization and capitalism, especially from the global imperialist viewpoint. In specific terms, these critical scholars have argued that since the birth of the modern world system in the long 16th century, the European imperialists have adopted, I quote, variegated methods of labor control for different products in different zones of the world economy. In their words, ethnicity is the so-called cultural staple of the entire world system. And racialization and colonization have worked simultaneously to other and abject entire people so that they can be enslaved, excluded, removed, and killed in the name of progress and capitalism. So I'm drawing on these critical ideas to show how the Chinese category was constructed and imagined over 6 centuries by a succession of dominant imperialist capitalist interests in Southeast Asia. I divide this into 4 phases. The first phase, which is the European global imperialism around 1500 to 1830, or what we sometimes call trading post-colonialism. And second phase would be around 1780 to 1950, again, spearheaded by the Europeans, Western Europeans. The third phase would be the American global imperialism, especially after the Second World War until around 1980. And last but not least, the impending PRC global imperialism from around 1980 to the present. The next slide, please. So the first phase would be, as I mentioned, a kind of trading post-empire. This was a time when the Europeans were not interested in large territories yet. And they started out really with the racialization of people. And because they were unable to establish trading bases in China, they extensively used the Chinese in Southeast Asia and treated and promoted them as the most desirable trade intermediaries from around 1600 to 1800. At the same time, downplaying other erstwhile trading groups such as the Malays, Bugis, and many of the South Asian and Middle Eastern traders. The second phase, which is around 1780 until 1950, it's sometimes called the second wave of the European global imperialism, is what is sometimes termed in Southeast Asia as a form of territorial colonialism. And this is when we see extended role of the Chinese as in Southeast Asia as commercial intermediaries of the colonial powers. And this is added as well with settler colonialism, especially in the case of the British Malaya. The continuing image of Chinese in Southeast Asia as most desirable trade intermediaries, as well as what I would call a kind of racialization plus. That is, that there's now a promotion of a race nation, not just race, but race nation construction. That is, every race belonging to one nation. And Chinese, of course, in Southeast Asia was regarded as a kind of foreign Orientals linked forever to China in European imagining. This also, of course, lead to institutionalized racialization extending to comments on comportment, such as hardworking Chinese versus lazy natives, and so on and so forth. The flip side of it is to demonize the Chinese as economic predators, especially with the increasing poverty of the native groups by the turn of the 20th century. And unintended consequences as well is that, which is not really desired by the Europeans, but it so happened due to the race nation connection, is to foster developments of overseas Chinese nationalism by the Qing and later the Republican Chinese elites regimes on the side. And this, of course, has been well discussed about how Chinese were then cultivated into patriots of China in order to derive benefits and investments from them. The third phase is, as I said, American global imperialism. Maybe the next slide is, and that is when we see this is, of course, this period of time after the Second World War was not just decolonization in Southeast Asia, but also the impact of global Cold War in the region as well. And after the Second World War, the new imperialist power taking over Europe, which is that is US, is now hoping to cultivate the newly decolonized countries in Southeast Asia as its allies and supply chains, global supply chains. And the fear, of course, of losing Chinese, which were regarded, thanks to the European phases of imperialism, they were now regarded as essential economic animals, and that the fear was that their departure might lead to economic instability, which of course will not boost the aims of the US and its allies and its allied elites in Southeast Asia. So the aim was not for full-scale repatriation, but taming these so-called Chinese into local citizens, especially after US-China rapprochement in the early 1970s. And meanwhile, by mid-1950s, the PRC now gaining power the CCP now gaining power in China, has abandoned the notion of Huaqiao, that is Chinese overseas as Chinese nationals, in contestation for alliance with the Southeast Asian, newly decolonized Southeast Asian countries. And of course, China at this time was also burdened by internal turmoil, and Southeast Asia, the overseas Chinese and including those in Southeast Asia were now referred to as 外籍华人 or foreign Chinese, that is cutting this kind of political ties with the Chinese overseas. In the fourth phase, with this current, what I call impending PRC global imperialism from around 1980 and especially in the present date, we see that there is now again a PRC reclaiming again these ties with the Chinese overseas. And now the term that was used was 华侨华人, that is blurring the lines between 华侨, of course, means Chinese nationals abroad, and 华人 means ethnic Chinese in a more general sense. But there was a deliberate way by using 华侨华人 to blur the lines between the nationals and the ethnic group. And of course, this was intensified with the initiation of the Belt Road Initiative in the 2010s. And as mentioned, we have seen simultaneous production of soft power types production, like the documentary of 2013, South of the Ocean, as well as the 华侨华人 historical series, which were published in the Chinese languages about Chinese overseas in different countries. So here we suddenly see that my brief conclusion is to say that long durée perspective needs to be combined with critical historical methods. Otherwise, it might be rendered into an imperialist tool, as what PRC state is doing in the present day period in terms of its appeal again to the Chinese overseas, this time not necessarily as Chinese nationals, but as generally ethnic Chinese, whether or not they are political linked is not so much of a matter. And from this reading, we can actually see that racialization will always be a tool of global capitalists or imperialists, whether it's in the past or even in the present, and probably right into the future. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Kian. That was really interesting. I was just wondering if you would be using your iPad for the discussion, or would you like to switch to your laptop just in case, or do you think that's fine for you?
I think I better stick to this because I don't know what's going on.
No worries. Yeah, that's all right. I can hear you and see you perfectly now, so it's fine. Next, would Jean like to go? Sorry, Jean, I think you might be muted.
Thank you, Callista, for inviting me to join this very interesting panel on the theme of time. And so I would like to start out with a few remarks about time. So time, of course, is a human construct, and it orders our personal as well as our public lives. And the calendar year in which we live anchors us in specific times. So this in Jewish time, this is the year 5781. And in Islamic time, it's the year 1442. And in Christian time, it is the year 2021. And Christian time has become merged with Common Era time, so that throughout the world, whatever our particular calendars are, we are also constantly in reference to Common Era time. Now, each of us lives our own personal history, and we live it alongside society's public and received history. And that may be incongruous to how we understand history from our own perspective. And we live amongst public reminders of time and public reminders of history in monuments and in sculptures and statues. And of course, these things may be obliterated. For instance, there's the tearing down deliberately of knowledge of the past. We can think of the Taliban in Afghanistan destroying the monumental Bamiyan Buddhists from the 600s. We can think of crowds in the United States today pulling down statues of Confederate generals. Or we could be in Australia, which has a white history of 200 years and a very long Indigenous history. And Indigenous history is marked on the landscape, not by statues and monumental arches, but by rock paintings in caves, and by designated trees, and by rocks. And these things are subject to being destroyed by willful ignorance of mining companies, and in urban settings by modern urban developers wanting to build a block of flats. And we also carry time on our bodies. So all of us have a mobile phone on our desk and in our pocket, and we carry time with us, and it is an instant time. We live in an instantness of time. And we know when we're lecturing to our students that they're all looking in another time on their mobile phone. But here we are talking about time, and the theme then is the longue durée. So it's a form of looking at history that calls for large conceptions of time. In the study of human history, it asks for a big picture. And it gives a long time frame in order to be able to discern the evolution of patterns within society. And the longue durée takes in short-term event history to draw on larger significances. There is an argument that the past teaches lessons that may inform the future. And long-term history counters micro studies, that is, studies of history on much smaller topics. Microhistory, it seems to me, is the product of historical empathy, because it is concerned with the ordinary person, every man and every woman, who gets a chance in microhistory to walk upon the stage of history. Now, there is a charge against microhistory, of course, and that is that it focuses on what might be seen as small topics of antiquarian interest. Or another charge is that it allows the historian to be disengaged from the society in which the historians are living and from the concerns of their own society. Now, I'm an historian of Indonesia, and Callista, if it's possible, just to show the map that I sent you, I think that would be helpful. So I'm showing you a map of Indonesia, and you'll perceive that it is an island nation, an archipelago state. It's made up of over 17,000 islands. And you can see that it drops off the mainland of Asia, and that it sort of blends into Micronesia in the east. And you can also see, in looking at that map, its geographic location in relation to the Islamic heartland in what is often called the Middle East. So I can go back to not having the map, thank you now. So I've tried in my scholarly work, I have done both microhistories and long-term studies. And in a book from a few years ago called Indonesia, Peoples and Histories, I tried to do both, to have long-term history with microhistory embedded in it. So I had a very long-term narrative beginning with evidence of human existence, maybe up to 40,000 years ago. But the first traces of writing that we have found to date in any Indonesian island, they date to the early years of the first centuries of our common era. And the evidence is writing on stone in Indic scripts, in scripts of the Pallava Indian script. And they are texts that boast about the king that they're praising as the greatest ruler of the world, and he is assigned royal titles that come from Sanskrit. And my book ends in the early years of the 21st century. So it's a very long narrative. And within this book, there are many micro-histories. So I've written capsules embedded in the narrative. So you can read the grand narrative, you can read the capsules, you can read all of them or some of them. So capsules are on subjects, as one critic rather unkindly said in a review of me, she writes about the things that interest her. So when is it I've written about the public kiss in Indonesian politics. When is it appropriate, or when does it cause controversy? I've written about Indonesian chronicles that tell us about Muslim saints that can fly and move mountains. Or I've got things on when coffee drinking is introduced and the impact of that on society. So at first, when I got this idea, I wasn't really thinking of combining longue durée and microhistory. I was thinking of my then teenage son, who I would watch reading on the internet, clicking from site to site to site and never stopping more than 2 minutes in one place. But so I persuaded Yale to allow me to write this form of history to meet a more modern readership, I hoped, being a relic of history myself. But what I was trying to do then was to give a different form of history. And I wanted to root myself within Indonesia as a sort of perspective growing out of Indonesia and not out of the Middle East or out of India or out of Europe. And the perspective, of course, shapes what facts we choose to produce in our histories. And perspective shapes our analyses and our conclusions. So I could give you a metaphor of a motor car driving down a country road in the dark with its headlights on, and the car is driving along and the driver can see what is in front of him or her. And on both sides of the road, it's all dark. And so I think of history like that you're looking at one thing, but at the same time, lives and histories are being told by people in many different ways. And so I tried to write a history that had many histories running parallel side by side, not arguing in a postmodern sense they're all of equal value at all, but in trying to bring into history multiple lives, multiple stories within a cohesive narrative. And my aim was also to write the colonial period of Indonesia's history, that is, when it was part of the Dutch East Indies. It was to integrate that into Indonesian histories rather than writing it as a sharp break from the past, or as soon as I brought the Dutch into the picture in 1595, suddenly telling the story of the Dutch overseas, and then not resuming Indonesian history until 1945, when Sukarno proclaims the independence of the Republic of Indonesia. Now, there are constraints on historians always, but I have to say, for me, I've had a privileged existence. I've had access to research dollars. I've been able to go to libraries all over the world and to conferences, and I haven't had any guidance from on high, so to speak, on what I would write about. But if I think about my colleagues in Indonesia, then I think we get an entirely different perspective, because we have to consider Indonesia's historians in 1950. Here they are, heirs to a brand new state. There's never been a state of Indonesia before until sovereignty is transferred from the Netherlands. So in the 1950s, they're called on to write history that is national and nationalist. They've got to convince people. Indonesia has 17,000 islands. It has 350 different ethnic groups and languages. So how do they amalgamate those people to produce them to be Indonesians in a modern state? And to sort of think about it, how is it that we can think about we can think about the resumption of control of a society and write in a particular way. And how is it, as an historian, that we can take all these different peoples, all these different language speakers, who have ancestors who are spirits, who are Hindu and Buddhist gods, and how have they ended up to be 270 million Indonesian Muslims today? Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, and it is on the furthest periphery from the Islamic heartland. And in most world history books on Islam, it all stops at India, and Malaysia, Singapore, the whole part of Muslim Southeast Asia is missing. So how do we do this? And for Indonesian historians, the call and the duty to give people a unifying public history. But then the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979 then creates a whole different aspect. Now Indonesian historians are being called on to write a history that seamlessly integrates Indonesia into global Islamic history, into a global Islamic history where often they're not even recognized as existing. So in a sense, there's little time for Indonesian historians to indulge in microhistory, looking for socioeconomic explanations of small things that will make up a larger whole. And in fact, historians today, colleagues of mine, feel under enormous pressure, that they're under danger always of being accused of ignoring the hand of Allah in history making, that they're giving secular socioeconomic explanations of human past rather than seeing a divine guiding light, because we know the end of time, there's a set viewpoint when history will end. So I ask myself, can a long view of history give us lessons? And I guess the answer is yes, but I would then ask, to whom do those lessons go? Well, I think to students of history. I believe that the reality of politics is expedience, and necessity for quick decisions and quick policy making. There's no enlisting historians in their comfortable university offices to offer policy. And I believe that the intractable problems of the past are the intractable problems of today, that we have learned nothing. So I think of the scourge of anti-Semitism, I think of the scourge of racism, I think of domestic violence, I think of poverty, the destruction of the environment. What have we learned? Now, historians may be able to, and certainly do, give illuminating background, but there are few who listen. History is not popular amongst university students today, and history departments everywhere are closing. My own School of History, when I started at University of New South Wales in 1992, we lasted as a School of History until we were folded into Languages and History. And now in 2021, we're going to be part of the School of Architecture. So it seems to me that resources these days are going towards subjects that are of use to society. We have to know about how to stop climate change and so on. So I do think history gives us wonderful insights, and it is a crime not to be aware of history. But I do think the question of who does history speak to has to be really taken very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I think that was a fascinating presentation, and I can't wait to discuss some ideas about your presentation later on. Shall we have Joe next?
Yes, thank you, Callista. And I just want to start off by saying what an honor it is to be with these two historians of the longue durée in the Pacific world, Jean and Kwee. I'm enlightened. I have so much respect for what you're doing and for all of the richness that you bring to this conversation. And I've been taking innumerable detailed notes on your presentations. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I'll pick up where Jean left off. on a post-historical age. I'd say that the prophet of a post-historical age was probably the science fiction writer, Isaac Asimov. In the first book of his Foundation series, originally written as an octet of short stories in 1942, Asimov invented a hero named Harry Seldon, who was a gifted mathematician, who discovers a way to reduce the dynamics of human civilization into variables that can be used to predict and avert the inevitable collapse of civilizations that all societies are heir to. In a narrative that loosely parallels Gibbon's account of the fall of Rome, Asimov's narrative plays out in a universe several millennia in the future, where human bureaucrats from the planet Trantor, having colonized the Milky Way, press their empire to the point of overreach. Unlike ancient Rome, however, Trantor possesses a quantified social science capable of charting the difficulties ahead, and perhaps of advising empire's leaders about how to navigate them. So through his painstaking statistical research, Harry Seldon has discovered centuries before anyone might have done so with the traditional tools of history or political science, that the great empire in its apex of glory has already begun its slow collapse, reducing the complexity of human society to a grand calculus as predictable as a chess game. Seldon anticipates the myriad problems that will come in startling detail, and he uses his mathematical models to devise intricate proactive strategies to reduce the time that Trantor, like Rome, would endure an inevitable dark age to come. None of this would have been possible without the models that predict with great certainty what was about to happen, or without the intervention of Seldon's followers, the historical engineers. Now, decades after Asimov's protagonist created his nearly flawless predictive science, modern biologists and computer engineers have begun to ask the question that this panel was asked to contemplate. Can the past predict the future? So a biologist, Peter Turchin, a scholar of insect behavior, 2 decades ago began to turn his keen observation of insects and dynamic laws onto human societies, and to begin to theorize how quantitative models might apply to our own species, thus extrapolating laws that govern human history. Now, through his statistical analyses of Chinese revolt, Turchin found a correlation, he believed, between population collapse and revolution. As these two events appeared to have a causal relationship, at least the way that Turchin modeled them, he developed a theory about how dramatic collapse in population could predict the destabilization of society. And yearning to predict human dynamics, Turchin expanded his research and began to extrapolate a series of hypothetical laws of historical behavior around population collapse and revolution. Perhaps, he reasoned, an abundance of certain kinds of individuals could predict civil discord, for instance, if there was an abundance of second sons, or for example, an abundance of lawyers. Turchin's theories grew more complex until they became nothing less than a form of algebra, whose robustness was descriptive and even, he thought, a predictive tool. Now, to classical historians, Turchin's hypothetical laws may be as much fantasy as the psychohistory of Harry Seldon, but the correlations he makes and the questions they pose are inherently interesting. They're not unlike dynamics of population or class resentment that have intrigued classical historians in former eras. Perhaps, for example, where baby booms predict a counterculture in developed countries in the United States. They're not unlike questions that other economic historians have raised about second sons becoming members of the clergy and the results of marriage of the most intelligent members of the community in Judaism over the longue durée. So historians tend to think about new events by comparing the details of new phenomena with the old. According to the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, every seemingly novel event reinscribes similar events in the past. Like Freud, Koselleck thought that habit and repetition structure how humans learn language, culture, and behavior. Koselleck also thought that interruptions to repetition structure the major changes in history from generation to generation, and that these disruptions could only be known by careful study and comparison of events in the past. So consider the events that have recently transpired in my country in January 6th. And I've decided at the last minute that I might share an image if you don't mind. Is this all right? The individuals who stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C. to protest and derail the certification of Biden's presidency gathered to play out their roles in a dynamic narrative already formed in their psyches. And while they may have imagined the gathering to be a novel event on many levels, it was an imaginative encounter with what historians call cultural memory. Whether they gleaned their mental images from documentaries, television news, personal accounts on blogs, or elementary school textbooks, we can confidently say that every individual who was storming Congress on that day had substantially formed ideations about what they were doing, mined from the historical tropes of protest. Consciously or unconsciously, some may have imagined that they were carrying the eternal torch of the rebel colonists at the Boston Tea Party, while others may have seen themselves in more contemporary terms as a conservative rejoinder to the George Floyd marches of Black Lives Matters that flooded American cities earlier that year. Similarly, as legal narratives were constructed about the storming of Congress, prosecutors will build their cases from historical paradigms gleaned from past protests and insurrections. Their collectively understood aims, their contextual significance in a democracy, and a suite of evocative images already having been formed in the legal imagination, which embodies the balanced punishment to be meted out for a crime of such and such weight and significance. Likewise, the vast majority of citizens who observe and analyze these events and their repercussions as spectators cannot help but apply their own already formed mental images to these events, and from myriad historical reference points and paradigms of protest, a variety of colorful narratives will be constructed. Now, professional historians, of course, bring to this analysis a set of tools that strive for a greater precision and are ideally as carefully crafted as the scientific method. Historians strive to ask each other the thorny questions, for example, whether a conservative mob is truly conservative as semantics shift from decade to decade. They may locate vast philosophical chasms and subtle shifts and recognize when conservative no longer means the law and order party, but rather a perspective of outrage directed at orderly institutions. They may try to discern where the language of conservatism tacitly embraces the values of white supremacy and where it clumsily marks legitimate grievances that are essentially proletariat in nature. So one of the most crucial tools available to a professional historian is the extensive and refined collection of examples from the past. Historians must, of course, apply these examples with subtlety and precision to meaningfully illuminate their repetitions in contemporary events. One hopes to apply good methodology, for example, when interpreting the storming of Congress with tropes and narratives of conservative riots from distant historical contexts. But despite these challenges, a profound knowledge of historical parallels is indispensable for illuminating modern events. When interpreting the recent events in Washington, for example, the British historians who were on Twitter that night noted the similarity between these riots and the Gordon riots of 1780, where seemingly conservative protesters were mobilized around a conspiracy theory regarding the undue influence of Roman Catholics in Hanoverian England. And they were urged by charismatic leaders to burn down every carceral institution in London. The Gordon riots, once seen as the last gasp of a pre-modern anti-Catholicism, are now understood as one of the first major instances of political cohesion among working class Britons, a hungry and desperate group who would soon form the first trade unions and organize themselves around the right to vote, and ultimately form the groundwork for the Labour Party and the birth of socialism. Meanwhile, many historians mined their historical knowledge of civil rights struggles to ask what these contemporary events revealed about the persistence of institutional racism. It was lost on few historians that the 60-odd arrests of the mainly white rioters were fragrantly milder than the broadcast use of police and paramilitary force earlier in the year in the George Floyd protests, where as many as 14,000 protesters were arrested. As pictures of the Capitol Police taking selfies with the people storming Congress began to circulate, historians examined the arcana of the mob's tattoos and incendiary sweatshirts and t-shirts, some celebrating Hitler's Holocaust and calling for the further murder of Jewish people. Historians who had studied the rise of white supremacy groups in contemporary America were quick to show that this had not only been brewing for decades, but had been cultivated quite consciously, not only within obscure right-wing echo chambers, but through dog whistles and incendiary shibboleths from the Oval Office itself, amplified through wordingly large proportions of politicians, pundits, conspiracy bloggers, and media journalists. Historians also asked careful questions about how we might know when a mob's actions were over. And some noted that Hitler's similarly raucous attempt at a coup d'etat in the beer hall push of 1923, although quickly quelched, nevertheless anticipated his rise to power a decade later. Others gathered examples of seemingly failed coups, such as Mussolini's March on Rome, which heralded a resurgent moment later. Carefully thinking through the sequence of such events, historians ruminated over the consequences of ignoring these protests, even after they had erupted in violence. And they were thinking, in part, about what Koselleck, whose early experiences included joining the Hitler Youth and then some voluntary years as a Nazi soldier, had called the repetition of events. Even if this mob had, for now, been stopped in its tracks, the March on the House of Representatives, once enacted, could continue to exert its magnetic pull on future events. Even a failed mob, once suppressed, its most aggressive participants tracked down and imprisoned, and a president himself impeached for encouraging it, it could have the capacity to inspire further repetitions. The same realization played out not only in the dialogues of historians, but in the fantasies of other conservatives who discussed similar historical insurrections where the mob's aim had been more clearly articulated. Very little has been able to stop such repetitions from happening, especially when they are energized by underlying grievances. For instance, the decline in real incomes in America since 1974, or the perception that American politics is structured so as to prohibit participatory politics from below. With each new protest, the community's language tends to become more refined, its aims clarified, its talking points, its mental images and constructions more widely embraced. So we can consider again the Gordon riots. From a conservative anti-Catholic mob comes an organized working class, assembled into monster mobs reciting the history of exclusion of the working people from British politics since the Norman invasion, demanding the right to vote, organizing itself around newspapers and housing collectives, determined no matter what the cost to elect its members to parliament. From those protean and disorganized beginnings, that party eventually sounded the death knell for the British aristocracy as it had existed in the 18th century. The children of working parents for the first time began to attend state-funded schools, and the parents were able to retire on old age pensions funded by taxes gathered from the rich. Country houses are abandoned because they are now too expensive to maintain. The old order crumbled and a new one was born. Memory, event, repetition, these are the components of a humanistic method of reasoning about the past and the future, as robust as any scientific method that Asimov dreamed. None of these components are the basis for concrete laws of history. They are instead important dynamics that reveal theories of history, because their application to any given event must always be tested. A law prescribes, but a theory is adjusted to support an adequate description of an entirely novel, complex, and never repeated experiment that constitutes each new moment in time.
Thank you so much, Joe. Would you like to stop your screen share?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So it has been really interesting listening to all three of you present your insights on a theme, and let's move into kind of a discussion about your ideas about whether the past can indeed predict the future, and also some of the dangers or some of the benefits of utilizing the longue durée historical method in our analyses. So perhaps my first question would be directed to Kian. And if any of you would like to jump in at any point in time to ask a question to your fellow colleague, please do so. So my first question would be to Kian. And at the very end of your presentation, you mentioned that critical historical tools should be utilized along a longue durée method or longue durée approach, because it runs the danger of being utilized or rendered as an imperial tool in how you in your examination of Chinese history and what the Chinese government is currently doing by employing the longue durée, by asserting and reclaiming, as you've quoted, Chinese nationals. So I was wondering what such critical historical tools would look like, and what do we have to be careful or mindful of when utilizing a longue durée perspective to history?
I suppose what really the core of the argument is that long durée, short durée, that's certainly especially in the field on Chinese overseas, and particularly pertaining to the Chinese in Southeast Asia, that there is it can be a double-edged sword. That it can also be used by powers with imperialist ambitions that would turn it also the other way around. And my argument really is to say that even historians in the field who have taken on longue durée history has tended to view ethnicity as a kind of positivist identity category rather than see how it is in fact part of the racialization and capitalism game over a long durée. So if we take Chinese and other ethnic groups as positivist identity category, then long durée history will actually promote that sense of being forever. It can promote a kind of ethnocentrism and give it further power by adding a very long genealogy to these types of ideas. And what I'm also showing with that case of what the PRC state is doing now is to show how it has been fruitfully mining from these kinds of ideas, both combining longue durée as well as the reading of ethnicity as a positivist identity category. So how do we then deconstruct this? The idea is really to return to the what do you call it? How that history has been constructed and how that body of literature, what kinds of historical corpus we have been mining from. And we'll see that, in fact, these are, especially with regards to the Chinese in Southeast Asia, these are usually written by very powerful imperialists, powers with imperialist interests and capitalist interests, and how that has been done over at least 5-6 centuries. So, not sure if I answer your question, but.
Thank you. No, I think it's really important that you mentioned that we have to be conscious of who is constructing the historical narrative, and it really ties in with being more discerning when we actually question where the histories come from and what are they trying to teach us as well. So thank you for your response. My next question goes to Jean, where she shares a bit about how she has written a longue durée history and embedded micro histories within it. And my question to you is whether, in your perspective, can they coexist and can they coexist peacefully?
Well, thank you for that question. Excuse me, I think microhistories are really crucial because while we are looking at long-term trends and we fall into the temptation to see history repeating itself, the context of now, the person's contemporary context is always different. I'll give one example. When President Suharto of Indonesia, who ruled for 30 years, proclaimed himself president for life, and he, during his period of government, the martial law extended for the entire time. That is, rule by the military with military courts and so on. And so many people said, oh, he's just like a Dutch governor general. But if we look back at Dutch governor generals, they had 40,000 troops at their disposal for 17,000 islands. And about 30,000 of those troops were from different Indonesian ethnic communities. Whereas the modern president for life had 6 million troops at his disposal. He can occupy whole places in the archipelago. So I think that we need microhistory to keep reminding ourselves that superficial similarities are only superficial. And while it's fascinating to see certain displays of pomp and circumstance, for instance, but we could look back and look at the Dutch, for instance. And I'd like to bring up the issue of ethnic labeling. If you look at labels in Indonesian history, the label is always taken by the man's identity. So 85% of Dutch people in Indonesia at the end of the Dutch colony were half Indonesian or all Indonesian. They had grandmothers and aunties and uncles who were Indonesian, but their mothers, on marrying a Dutchman, became listed as a Dutch person. And similarly, when a Chinese in Indonesia married a Balinese woman, she becomes counted in the census as Chinese. Her history as a Balinese is obliterated. And we're also given this incredible confusion. And we could notice in Indonesia that it is the unique, I think, in Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, that Chinese lost the command of their own native languages. And they are speakers of Indonesian, and they are the creators of modern Indonesian language through their early writings and novels and their control of the printing press and so on. So my view then is longue durée is very necessary, but it has to be tempered and modified always by looking at the specific context in which something's taking place. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And now my question is directed for Joe, who has given a very interesting presentation on especially how you read the events of January 6th. So thank you so much for that. My question would be, as you've mentioned in the last minutes of your presentation, that the humanistic method is as robust as any scientific method because it allows us to read the dynamics of historical events and use it to construct theories of history that we then revise according to what happens in the present. My question would be whether such methods are as reliable when we perhaps take into consideration that how we read events in the past are also colored by perhaps present understandings, present pressures, and also present theories, as you've rightly mentioned that semantics do shift over time. So I would just like to hear your insights on that, firstly. And a second question that I had also was, because of your background as a data scientist alongside as a historian, what is the potential of digital humanities in enhancing the longue durée perspective and our study of it? Thank you.
Thanks. So, Calista, you ask an interesting question. You ask a question that comes out of a place of, a conservative might say relativism. Someone schooled in the social sciences might say of deconstruction, which is to say the continental philosophies that came of age in the 1960s and 1970s in most of the modern disciplines. And which is to say that you're asking a question about how our perspective on the past changes as we move through time. And it is absolutely true that it does. But if you take that insight to an extreme, then you get to the place that the conservatives rightly dismiss as relativism. Relativism, therefore, we cannot know anything. Therefore, humanistic study isn't as robust or as strong as scientific methods. Because it's all that the humanities are characterized as the discipline that shows bias. While you say that it's that the Civil War happened, but the Civil War is tainted with the racial bias of white America. Therefore, 100 years from now, we think about it in a different way entirely. That charge of relativism, I think, misses that insights in the humanities do tend to be cumulative. It's not merely that one perspective displaces the next. It's not merely that one fad comes into being and it's feminism this year and next year we'll care about sexuality. Rather, each of those insights tends to compound, especially if you look over the longue durée. And this is one of the places where taking a longue durée perspective on the knowledge of the humanities can be really useful. So if you think about where critical historical interpretation comes to the fore for the first time, at least in Western civilization, you have to think about moments like the first concordances. So the Bishop Eusebius, early in the history of the Christian church, starts putting the accounts of the Gospels side by side and reading them against each other to establish whether they have the same facts in the same order or where they disagree. Side-by-side comparison. It's a data analysis. He's drawing a virtual Venn diagram. And the making of concordances that allow you to examine the facts and the words of different biblical translations, different accounts, different documents becomes one of the major enterprises of monks and bishops for the entirety of the Middle Ages. Enormous quantities of sheepskin are produced to make these volumes that index individual words with exactly the kind of keyword count that we could nowadays call up in just a second using a keyword search phenomenon. But before the era in which technology makes it possible, it was worth it to those people to examine keywords in context because it produces some kind of historical truth. In fact, the only historical truth that we can know. And the fact that that evolves from generation to generation, that what was once concordances applied to the Bible became the study of philology and the study of historical linguistics, which gave us insights into when different prehistoric cultures diverged from each other, and that has now informed critical theories of patriarchy and empire and the realities of our own era. That, I think, is a demonstration of the robustness and the cumulative accomplishments of the traditions of critical reading in the humanities. So you asked in a follow-up how the digital humanities intersects with this. The digital humanities is not a better method, and it does not displace those earlier methods, not at all. It builds upon them. It has the chance to build upon them. But perhaps a preliminary question is, what is the digital humanities? What is the digital humanities and why is it different from what they do in the computer science department? This is a crucial question. The computer science department also has specialists who care about many of the same things that I care about. They use computers to count words, to generalize patterns, sometimes generalizing patterns over time. They're called NLP specialists or natural language programming. And many of the best practitioners of NLP, natural language processing, are actually hybrid scholars. Many of them have first degrees in subjects such as history, literature, or the classics. And they've taken that sensitivity to language, form, and rhetoric and used it to devise programs that help make the Google search engine more robust because it really understands how language works. But in the digital humanities, we engage in the opposite process, or the process in reverse. We take the tools of computer science and we use them to try to establish patterns that are of interest to humanists, to tell us things about our own history. And what becomes possible when you move in that direction is another frontier of knowledge that looks something like the question, how would democracy be different if there was an app on my phone that could monitor every speaker in parliament today and tell me, do they sound more like the racists of the 19th century, or do they sound more like the sociology department at Oxford today? Who has changed the most during their tenure in Congress or in Parliament? Who is sounding like somebody from the 1980s? Who is saying something genuinely new? And how well are they representing the interests of ordinary people in my constituency, what they write about, how they talk on social media? We could imagine those questions going in a number of different directions, more or less married to the technologies and methods of participatory organizing today. But for my money, the interesting thing is what happens when they invite traditional historians who really care about parliament and democracy or the history of the civil rights movement into the room, and you ask them to examine these tools that you've been building to better mechanize readings of parliament by computer to help people index out of this vast mass of words, too much for anyone to read. How do we find the parts of the debate or the insights about individual speakers that allow citizens to come to their own conclusions about whether they're being adequately represented? And there, historians of parliaments and historians of civil rights and law have marvelous insights to bring to bear. So that's the promise of the digital humanities. It's a hybrid place. It's not the triumph of the digital over the humanities by any extent. And I don't think it's about displacing history or historians so much as making sure that there's at least some arena where the people who are enamored of the counting of words and the designing of algorithms and even fantasies of predicting the future based on laws of human nature, where their tools can be critically inspected and sometimes engaged by people who come from the rich and dense traditions of the humanities.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think you've outlined very clearly what the digital humanities is and helped us unpack that idea. So thank you for that. I think we're running a bit short on time, so I'll be asking a final question to all three of our panelists. And this is an open question, so you can choose to take it whenever you wish to. But I think a recurring theme is that we've realized, as Jean mentioned in her presentation, that the rates of students taking history have declined in recent years. And this made me curious as to whether history's value is in, or relevance is in, relating itself to the present. And should we actually, relate history to the present and perhaps find lessons for the future in order to continue to assert our relevance? And if so, how do you envision history's enhanced role, perhaps in policy making or in other fields that are perhaps more geared towards the present and future? So this is a question that is open to all panelists, and you're welcome to take them.
I could say in a very general way that when the History Manifesto came out, one of the things we advocated there was that historians take more of a role in the subjects that are pressing interest today, like climate change, economic inequality, and international governance. And it was greeted warmly by a certain kind of political historian who had ambitions of advising Whitehall and writing short reports. And then rather sadly, there was no bridge made to the kind of microhistorian, social historian of experience like Jean. There's a gulf between those worlds. And Jean, I guess I heard you say in your presentation that policy is cheaply made, quickly made, and history takes time. And I think that's true. But it's also been my experience that many social historians, cultural historians, and historians of microhistory are drawn to the subject originally because they have some social motivation. There's some change that they want to see in the world, and that's realized in different ways. And I wonder if I could just ask you to comment on that, if you will, if you have anything to say.
Well, I do think it's a crime that we don't know more about our own pasts. And it bothers me in a particular issue that's going on in Australia right now. We celebrate Australia Day on January the 26th, which is when the first fleet arrived with shiploads of convicts who were sentenced to 7 years of exile. And it doesn't take into account that the first fleets were not arriving in empty land. They were arriving into places of scattered communities that didn't appear to be having sort of complicated societies and so on. And so there's a whole part of our community that feels that we have to move day and throw down every statue of Captain Cook. And to me, what bothers me about that is that the extraordinary courage it took to put sailors on a ship, even in periods when they still weren't quite sure whether the world was round or not, or whether they're going to fall off the end of it, and to endure months at sea, and to be wanting to view the stars and discover things about nature and the world, that we're throwing all of that out because we're trying to right an historical wrong towards the Indigenous minority, which is the host to the migrant majority. And I think while schools, in primary school at least, are really trying to address this with lots and lots of cultural stories and so on, and I'm a volunteer in Indigenous literacy programs for urban disadvantaged Indigenous children. I think the schools are doing a remarkably fine job. I think anytime you start considering something like a national day, it then brings out animosities from people who feel, well, they're not recognized. So our current Prime Minister said, wait a moment, my great-grandfather was a convict on one of those ships. You know, he came out in chains, he was dumped here. And what he might have then added was that hardly any convicts returned to Britain when they were allowed to after 7 years. But what they did was they created themselves as new people and started building up the modern part of society that we know in competition with Indigenous groups. And nowadays people talk about the invasion of Australia, but in fact, I think invasion is actually a provocative term, but it's also historically very inaccurate. I remember visiting Uluru, which it used to be called Ayers Rock. It's a huge, massive mountain in the middle of the desert in Central Australia. And the Indigenous guide who was showing us around said, you know, my people are Central Desert people. And while everybody, politicians and Aboriginal rights people are saying is this is the symbol of Australia, he said, we live 20 k's from here, but we didn't know it existed until about the 1930s. So I think history can cause lots and lots of animosities, and it's time to cool everything down and start thinking we've got to know other sides of the stories. You tried also in your presentation to suggest that people who were attacking the Capitol, which has shocked all of us, had personal grievances and understandings of history that motivated them. And most of us sitting in another country saying, oh, you could vote, look at the American masses, we needed you to bring out that they're acting on specific senses of injuries in an historical past. So I don't think I'm answering your question or Callista's, but I'll stop there so that we can join in.
Well, I do maybe have a very small remark to make. I mean, I think when Callista invited me to join this panel, I was actually very reluctant. I think now I can see why I was reluctant, because this is a really huge question. I think history will always be relevant to the present. I think what maybe especially I think all three presentations show is that we're all tackling to something that is very relevant to our region or our area. You know, like I think I really like what Jean was talking about. You know, about the Australian Day and the relevance of it, and of course from I mean, Joe's presentation on looking at America and what's, you know, and in my case, I was really partly motivated, of course, by the state of the field, but of the historical field, but also partly very concerned with what I see as a kind of racecraft going on, not just in Singapore, but also in the wider Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific, and especially what the PRC state and its rise would mean. So I think we are all speaking from a very, how do you call it? We need that specific context to actually index the relevance of history, rather than just say, you know, how can the past, present, the future? I mean, what I'm saying is we do need a context from which to speak from, so to speak.
Yes, that's very true. So thank you so much to all our speakers. It has been a great time listening to all of your presentations, and also thank you for taking part in a thoughtful discussion